Still fixing air conditioners for a living? Or did you finally get promoted to something with a desk?
Careful. You're talking like you know something I don't, do you?
4 days earlier, my legal team had closed a deal that put $287 million into an account with my name on it. She had no idea. My name is Andre Whitfield. I'm 38 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life learning that a man's value isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself at a party. It just keeps showing up, night after night, whether anyone's counting or not. My father drove a service van for 22 years, fixing window units and central air systems across East Baltimore, mostly in the kind of summer heat that made grown men curse under their breath in their own kitchens. I used to ride with him on Saturdays when I was maybe 9, 10 years old, watching him climb onto rooftops with a toolbox that weighed more than I did. He never rushed a job, never cut a corner, even on the ones where the customer couldn't tip and barely said thank you. One evening, he came home late, sat down on the front steps of our row house on Eastern Avenue, and started untying his work boots without saying a word. I asked him why he never complained about the long hours, why he kept driving out to jobs that paid the same whether he finished in 1 hour or 5. He didn't look up right away. He just said, "You don't need anybody to see you working, son. You just need to make sure that when they need you, you're already there." I was too young to understand what that meant. I understand it now the way you understand a scar, from the inside out, not from a story somebody told you about it. I grew up in Patterson Park, in a house 2 blocks from the pagoda, where the summers smelled like cut grass and somebody's grill going 3 houses down. My mother worked the front desk at a medical clinic on Eastern Avenue for almost as long as my father drove that service van, and between the two of them, we never had much. But we never went without either. Denise and I met at a community college night class, back when I was studying HVAC certification and she was finishing up business admin. She had this laugh that filled up a whole room, sharp and sudden, the kind of laugh that made strangers turn their heads to see what was so funny. For a long time, I thought that laugh was the whole point of my life, the thing I'd chase for as long as it kept coming. We got married young, at a small church off Broadway in Fells Point, her mother crying through the whole ceremony, my father standing beside me in a suit he'd only worn twice before. We had Zoe 2 years later, on a Tuesday in March, and I remember holding her in the hospital thinking I finally understood what my father meant about showing up when it counts. My father held her often those first months, driving over most Sundays, even as his own health started slipping, though the memory that stays clearest is that first afternoon in the hospital, his big, rough hands cradling her like she might break, though I'd never once seen those same hands hesitate on a rooftop job. "She's got your mother's eyes," he told me, which wasn't quite true. But I let him have it anyway, because some things a man says holding his first grandchild don't need correcting. A stroke took him that winter, sudden enough that none of us had time to prepare for it, though he held on afterward. Slower in the body, but still sharp in the mind. Sitting most days by the window in a chair my mother moved in special for him. He passed 6 months later, quiet, in his sleep, the same steady way he'd done most things in his life. I inherited his old toolbox, half his tools already worn smooth from decades of use, and I kept it in the truck for years afterward, using pieces of it on my own service calls long after I could have afforded new ones. For a while it felt like something solid, like we'd built a floor under ourselves that wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't. The unraveling didn't happen in one night. It happened the way a roof leaks, slow and quiet, until one morning you look up and there's water damage across the whole ceiling and you can't remember exactly when it started. Denise started staying late at work, first once a week, then twice, then most nights. And I told myself it was just a demanding job, the kind that eats into evenings without meaning anything by it. I picked up the slack without thinking twice, cooking dinner, running baths, reading Zoe the same 3 books over and over, until she had them memorized before she could read a single word herself. There was a stretch of maybe 8 months where Denise and I barely had a real conversation. The kind where you actually look at each other instead of just trading logistics about pickups and bills. I noticed her phone face down on the counter more often than it used to be. I noticed the new perfume, the new gym membership, the new habit of taking calls out on the porch with the door closed. I told myself I was imagining things, because the alternative felt like more than I wanted to carry on top of everything else. Denise left when Zoe was 3, moved in with a man she'd met through work, and told me I'd always been more comfortable fixing things than talking about them. Maybe she was right about that. I didn't argue, and I didn't beg her to stay either, because some part of me had already made peace with it long before she said the words out loud. I signed what needed signing, and I kept the house on Eastern Avenue, the one with the front steps my father used to sit on, the one where I'd learned everything I actually knew about being a man. Some folks in the neighborhood looked at me different after that. Like a man raising a daughter alone was a problem to be solved instead of just a man doing what needed doing. My mother used to say, "Andre, you can't raise a girl by yourself. You need help." And I'd nod and say I was managing, even on the nights I wasn't. There were mornings I drove Zoe to school on no sleep. Coffee gone cold in the cup holder, radio off because the silence felt like the only honest thing left in the day. I remember one winter, Zoe needed braces the dentist said couldn't wait, an estimate that ate through nearly everything I'd managed to set aside in the account I kept for emergencies. 2 years of careful saving gone in a single phone call to the orthodontist's office. Even after draining that account, I was still short by a few $100s. The kind of gap that doesn't look like much written on paper, but feels like a canyon when payday's still 2 weeks out. I had my father's old watch, the one he wore on every service call for 22 years. Steel band worn thin at the clasp, the crystal scratched from decades of rooftop work. It wasn't worth much to anybody else, but it was enough, along with picking up extra weekend calls for the next 6 weeks, to close the gap without falling behind on anything. I sold it to a pawn shop on Eastern Avenue without telling a soul. Not my mother, not my sister, nobody. I told Zoe her braces were a gift from her grandmother. That wasn't a lie exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth, and I've made peace with the difference over the years. There was a 4th of July cookout in Fed Hill, maybe 2 years after the divorce, where Denise showed up with her boyfriend at the time. Some guy in finance who talked with his hands a lot and laughed louder than the joke deserved. She introduced me to her friends as Zoe's dad, not my ex-husband. Like the marriage itself had been edited out of the record entirely. Like 5 years together had never actually happened. Somebody asked what I did for work, and before I could answer, Denise said, "He fixes air conditioners," in a tone that made it sound like an apology on my behalf. Like she needed her new friends to understand she'd upgraded since then. Nobody laughed outright. But I felt the temperature of the room shift. The way you feel a storm coming before the sky changes color, before the first drop even hits the ground. I didn't say anything back. Anger is a debt I never wanted to carry. And I'd learned a long time ago that a man who spends his energy proving people wrong rarely has any energy left to actually become right. I went home that night, put Zoe to bed, and sat at the kitchen table with a laptop I'd bought secondhand off a classified site. The screen cracked in the top left corner, held together with clear packing tape gone slightly yellow at the edges. I didn't know yet what I was building. I just knew I couldn't keep standing in rooms, waiting for people to see something in me they'd already decided wasn't there. There was another night, maybe 8 months later, when Zoe woke up burning, 104 on the thermometer, her whole small body shaking under the blanket in a way that scared me more than I let my voice show. I didn't call anybody first. I wrapped her in the blanket off my own bed, carried her straight to the truck, and drove to the urgent care on Eastern Avenue myself, hazards on the whole way. Running 2 lights I had no business running. The nurse there, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes, took one look at Zoe and moved fast, no wasted questions. The kind of fast that tells you the fear in your chest wasn't imagined. I called Denise from the waiting room after they'd taken Zoe back, my hands still not quite steady. "We're at urgent care," I said. "She spiked to 104. They're running tests." There was music behind her again, voices, the clatter of somewhere that wasn't home. "She's probably fine," Denise said, barely missing a beat. "Kids run high fevers all the time. It always looks scarier than it is. Call me if there's actually something wrong." "There's 104-degree fever," I said. "That is something wrong." "You know what I mean," she said, already sounding like she wanted the call to end. "Keep me posted." She didn't ask what tests. She didn't ask if I needed anything, or if I was all right, or offer to come. The line just went quiet, and then it was gone. Zoe's fever finally broke a little after 4, in a bright, humming exam room that smelled like antiseptic. Her small hand wrapped around one of my fingers the entire time, like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. I whispered the same nonsense songs my father used to hum on those rooftop jobs, low under my breath. More for myself than for her by that point. Denise didn't come by that night, or the next day, or the day after that. It was almost 4 days later. Zoe already back to her normal self, running around the living room in her socks. When Denise finally stopped by, breezing in with a small stuffed animal she had picked up somewhere, already smiling before she'd even sat down. "See?" she said, glancing at Zoe bouncing on the couch, voice cool and satisfied, like she was collecting on a bet. "I told you it was nothing. You always did worry more than you needed to." I didn't answer her. I didn't correct her. Didn't mention the hazards on the highway or the nurse's face, or the 4 hours I'd spent watching numbers on a monitor, not knowing which direction they were about to go. I just nodded once and went to go make Zoe's dinner. On the outside, nothing about me moved. Inside, something had started turning that wouldn't fully settle again for a long time. Quiet and steady. The kind of storm that doesn't announce itself with thunder. It just changes the weather in a man permanently and waits for him to notice. I was tired of being the answer nobody respected, the man people mentioned with a small apologetic laugh, the punchline nobody meant to be cruel, but somehow always was. I was tired, more than anything, of being the only name on the list of people who actually showed up. So I started reading, late at night after Zoe was asleep, articles about coding, about app development, about how ordinary people with no formal training had built things that mattered to somebody besides themselves. It felt foolish at first. A grown man in his late 20s teaching himself something from scratch on a cracked laptop at a secondhand kitchen table. The kind of thing that seemed reserved for other kinds of people. But my father's voice kept coming back to me. That line about not needing anybody to see you working. Nobody was watching me those nights. That turned out to be exactly the point. And I didn't understand that yet. Not fully. Not the way I understand it now. There was a period, maybe a year into the divorce, when my mother sat me down at her kitchen table and asked me straight out if I was doing all right. If the quiet was starting to wear on me the way it wears on some men. I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way mothers do when they already know the answer isn't the whole truth. And she said, "Your father used to go quiet like this too, right before he'd surprise us with something we didn't see coming." I didn't tell her what I was starting to build. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Not even to her. Because saying it out loud meant somebody could tell me it wouldn't work. And some part of me wasn't strong enough yet to hear that. So I kept it inside, the way my father kept 22 years of rooftop work inside a single steady posture that never once looked tired in front of us. Zoe started kindergarten that same year, at a school 6 blocks from the house, and I remember standing at the gate the first morning watching her walk in without looking back, backpack almost as big as she was. Denise wasn't there for that first drop-off. She had a work trip, Or that's what she told me, though I never asked for details anymore by then, having learned that details rarely change the shape of the actual answer. I stood at that gate a long minute after Zoe disappeared inside, just breathing. The way you do when a moment lands heavier than you expected it to. There was a teacher there, Ms. Alvarez, who caught my eye and said, "First one's always the hardest to watch walk away." And I thanked her and didn't correct her about which kind of walking away I was actually thinking about. That winter, the boiler in the house went out during a cold snap. The kind that turns Baltimore row houses into ice boxes overnight. And I spent 3 days fixing it myself after work instead of calling somebody. Partly out of pride and partly because I genuinely didn't have the money to spare. Zoe slept in my bed those 3 nights, both of us under every blanket in the house. And she thought it was an adventure, a kind of camping trip indoors. And I let her believe that instead of telling her the truth about the numbers in my checking account. I got the boiler running again on the 3rd night, hands scraped and stiff with cold. And I sat on the basement steps afterward, just listening to it hum back to life, feeling something close to the same satisfaction my father used to describe after a hard job finally clicked into place. There was a Sunday, not long after that, when my sister Denise's cousin, technically my former cousin by marriage, ran into me at the grocery store on Eastern Avenue and asked, loud enough for 2 aisles to hear, whether it was true I was still doing that handyman thing. I told her it was HVAC work, not handyman work, though the distinction clearly didn't register with her, and she gave me a look that managed to be both pitying and satisfied at the same time, like my situation confirmed something she'd already decided about me. I didn't think much of it in the moment, but driving home with the groceries in the passenger seat, something in me shifted, quiet and permanent. The kind of shift you don't notice happening until you look back at it months later and realize that was the day something actually changed. I started sketching ideas that same week, nothing formal, just notes on the back of service call receipts. Questions I kept turning over about what parents like me actually needed and weren't getting from anybody. My mother noticed the notebook I'd started carrying around, the same kind of cheap drugstore notebook my father used to keep his service logs in. And she asked once what I was writing. "Just thinking some things through," I told her. And she let it go without pushing, the same way she'd let a lot of things go over the years, trusting that I'd tell her when I was ready. I wasn't ready for a long time. Zoe's 5th birthday fell on a Saturday, and I'd promised her a party at the rec center on Eastern Avenue, the kind with a rented bounce house and a sheet cake from the grocery store. Nothing extravagant, just enough to make a 5-year-old feel like the day mattered. 2 days before the party, my truck's transmission started slipping on the highway. The kind of sound a mechanic hears once and doesn't need to hear twice to know it's serious. The repair estimate came back at just over the amount I'd set aside for the party, almost to the dollar. Like the universe had done the math specifically to test me. I sat in that mechanic's waiting room for a long time, staring at a muted television bolted to the wall, running through every possible way to make both things happen without either one suffering. I ended up doing the repair myself in the driveway that weekend, borrowing tools from a guy 2 doors down, skinning my knuckles more than once, missing most of Saturday afternoon in the process. The party still happened. It just happened with me showing up 40 minutes late. Oil still under my fingernails, no matter how hard I'd scrubbed, apologizing to my mother, who'd covered for me without being asked, keeping the bounce house company and the cake candles unlit until I walked in the door. The mechanic 2 doors down waved off any payment when I tried to hand him something for the loaned tools, said only, "Your daddy fixed my furnace for free back in '98. We're square for another 20 years at least." Zoe never noticed I was late. She just ran at me full speed the second she saw me, already asking if I'd brought her present. And I picked her up and spun her once around the room. And for those few seconds, none of the rest of it mattered at all. That night, after everyone left and the rec center staff started folding up tables, I sat in the truck in the parking lot for a minute before driving home, hands still a little raw, thinking about how much of fatherhood turns out to be invisible math nobody ever teaches you how to do. My mother once told me, not long after that she'd watched my father do the exact same kind of math his whole life, quietly rearranging what little there was so that nobody in the house ever had to feel the shortage directly. He was good at making empty look full, she said. I don't know if that's a gift or a wound. Probably both. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the years since. I taught myself to code the way I imagine my father taught himself to read a wiring diagram, back before there was any video walking you through it. One mistake at a time, one late night at a time, nobody grading my work but the work itself. I'd get off a full day of service calls, pick up Zoe from my mother's, cook dinner, get her through homework and bath time in bed, and then I'd sit down at that cracked laptop around 10:30, and I wouldn't stop until my eyes gave out. The idea came slow, the way most honest ideas do, not in a single flash, but in a series of small frustrations that finally added up to something worth solving. I kept noticing other single parents at Zoe's school, at the park, in line at the pharmacy, all of us running the same math in our heads, trying to figure out childcare pickups and shared expenses and who was free on a Tuesday night if somebody's kid got sick. There wasn't a good tool for any of it. Nothing built by anybody who actually understood what it felt like to be the only adult in a house at 11 at night with a feverish kid and no backup plan. So I started building one, a simple app at first, something that lets single parents coordinate pickups, split costs, and find each other for support without a lot of noise or judgment attached to it. I called it Solo Parent. The name wasn't clever. It was just true. The plainest description of what it actually did. And I didn't think it needed to be dressed up in anything fancier than that. For almost 2 years, I built it alone, teaching myself database structure from forum posts, breaking things and fixing them at 2 a.m. with the ceiling fan clicking overhead and a mug of coffee gone cold and bitter beside the keyboard. There were nights the code simply refused to work, and I'd sit there staring at an error message until the sky outside turned gray, until I could hear the first bus rattling down Eastern Avenue, until Zoe's alarm clock started going off upstairs. I'd close the laptop, splash water on my face, and go make her breakfast like I hadn't been awake for 20 hours straight, because that was the deal I'd made with myself. That the two lives couldn't bleed into each other where she could see it. I pitched it to 3 different investment groups over those 2 years. Driving downtown in my one good shirt, folder of printouts under my arm because I didn't trust the Wi-Fi at any of their offices. The first one didn't return my calls after the initial meeting. No explanation. Just silence that stretched out until I understood it as an answer on its own. The second one sent a rejection email that read, in part, the market for this demographic shows limited monetization potential based on current data trends. I kept that email. I still have it, saved in a folder I never deleted, not out of bitterness, but as a kind of marker, a reminder of exactly where I was standing when somebody told me no. The third meeting was the hardest. A small firm downtown that agreed to hear me out after a mutual acquaintance made an introduction, and the man across the table looked at my resume, looked at me, and said, "No offense, but you're an HVAC technician. What makes you think you can run a tech company?" I didn't have a sharp answer for him that day. Not the kind you rehearse in the mirror and never actually get to use. I just said, I've been running something a lot harder than a company for the last 5 years. Nobody had to teach me how to keep something alive when it's not making a profit yet. He didn't invest. I left that meeting and sat in my truck in a parking garage on Pratt Street for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home, hands on the wheel, engine off, just breathing. There was a month, right around Zoe's 7th birthday, where the numbers got tight enough that I seriously considered putting my service truck up as collateral for a personal loan, just to keep the servers running another few weeks. I didn't sleep much that month, running numbers on a legal pad at the kitchen table after Zoe went down, trying to find some version of the math that didn't end with me choosing between the business and the truck I needed to actually earn a living. I remember standing at the stove, making Zoe's birthday pancakes, doing that same math in my head about server costs while she sat at the table coloring, completely unaware that her father was quietly holding two different lives together with the same two hands. I never told her. I never told my mother either. Not the real numbers. Not how close it got some weeks. Because some things a man carries alone, not out of pride, but because putting the weight on somebody else doesn't actually make it lighter. It just makes two people tired instead of one. There was a particular Tuesday I still think about, when a server outage took the whole app down for 6 hours during a stretch when 300 families were actively using it. And I fixed it alone at the kitchen table with Zoe doing her homework 4 feet away, asking me why I looked so worried over just a computer thing. I told her it was nothing, and I fixed it by midnight. And I never let her see how close my hands were shaking by the time it came back online. Around that same time, Denise posted a photo online from a rooftop bar downtown, her and her new fiancé. A caption underneath that read something about finally building the life I actually deserve. I saw it on my phone at 1 a.m, laptop open in front of me, half a line of broken code still blinking on the screen, cursor waiting on me to decide what came next. I didn't comment. I didn't need to, because I'd already stopped measuring my life against the version of it she liked to post about. I just closed the tab and kept working, because that's what the nights had become for me. A place where nobody's opinion of my life could reach me. A room with the door locked from the inside. By the 3rd year, the app finally started to catch. Slow at first, a few thousand users, then tens of thousands. Word spreading through parenting forums and local Facebook groups faster than any marketing budget could have managed. Renata Cole, a product strategist who'd left a corporate job to work independently, found the app through a friend, reached out cold, and eventually became my business partner. The first person outside my family I ever fully let in on what those 2 years had actually cost me. She was the one who finally got the 4th investment meeting to say yes, a modest seed round that let me quit the service calls and focus on solo parent full-time. Though I kept my toolbox in the truck out of some stubborn instinct I never quite explained to her. There's a particular memory from that 3rd year I still return to more than any other. A Tuesday night when the app crashed for the 2nd time in a month, and I genuinely believed, sitting there at the kitchen table at 1 a.m, that I'd finally hit the wall I couldn't build my way past. I called Jerome, half out of my mind with exhaustion. And he didn't say much useful about code because he doesn't know a thing about code. But he stayed on the phone with me for 2 hours anyway, just talking about nothing. About the Ravens game, about a girl he was seeing, while I worked through the problem in the background. Somewhere around 3 a.m, the fix finally clicked. Some small misplaced piece of logic I'd been staring past for hours. And I remember laughing out loud in an empty kitchen at 2:30 in the morning. The kind of laugh that comes from relief more than joy. Jerome asked what was so funny. I told him nothing. Just that I'd been an idiot for 2 hours over 1 line of code. He said, "Sounds about right for you." And we both laughed again. And I hung up feeling lighter than I had in weeks, grateful in a way I never fully said out loud to him. There was another moment, closer to the end of that 3rd year, when Zoe found me asleep at the kitchen table one morning, head down on my folded arms, laptop screen still glowing in front of me. She didn't wake me up right away. She told me later she just stood there a minute, worried, before finally shaking my shoulder gently and asking if I was okay. I woke up disoriented, neck stiff, and the first thing I said was an apology. Though she was only 6 and didn't understand yet what exactly I was apologizing for. "You fell asleep working again," she said, matter of fact, the way kids state things without judgment attached. I did, I told her. I'm sorry, baby. It's okay, she said. Grandpa used to fall asleep on the couch after work, too. Grandma told me. I hadn't expected that to land the way it did. Hearing my own daughter, without meaning to, draw a straight line between me and my father. Between two men separated by a generation, but connected by the exact same kind of tired. I got up, made her breakfast, and didn't touch the laptop again until she was at school. Though the app had a critical bug sitting unresolved the whole time. Because some mornings, the work simply has to wait. By the 4th year, Solo Parent had grown enough that we brought on 2 more people. A small customer support team working out of a shared office space downtown that Renata found through a friend. 3 desks and a coffee maker, and a window that looked out on a parking lot instead of the harbor. I still worked most nights after Zoe went to bed. Not because I had to anymore, but because the habit had become something closer to a discipline. A way of proving to myself, privately, that the version of me who almost gave up in that parking garage on Pratt Street was never coming back. The rejection emails I'd saved over the years sat in a folder I labeled, half-joking, receipts. And every so often, on a hard night, I'd open them and reread them, not for the sting, but as a kind of proof of distance traveled. The Baltimore Chamber of Commerce. Gala is the kind of event this city takes seriously. Held every year in the Four Seasons Ballroom overlooking the Inner Harbor. Local news cameras set up near the stage, the mayor usually making an appearance for at least 20 minutes before slipping out early. I almost didn't go. My business partner Renata told me I had to be there, that the acquisition news would be announced publicly that same week. And I needed to be seen, not hidden away at home the way I'd spent most of the last 5 years. I put on the one good suit I own, dark charcoal, no flash to it, and I drove downtown alone, radio off, the way I usually drive when I need to think. Zoe was at my mother's for the night, already asleep by the time I left, and I'd kissed her forehead and told her I'd be back before she woke up. The harbor was quiet that evening, water black and still under the string lights along the promenade, the air carrying that particular late autumn chill off the Chesapeake that gets into your collar no matter how good your coat is. I stood near the back of the ballroom for a while, holding a glass of water, listening to the low hum of conversation and a string quartet playing something slow near the windows, watching servers move through the crowd with trays of small appetizers. Nobody seemed to actually be eating. That's when I heard her laugh. Denise's laugh has always carried, ever since college, the kind of sound that finds you across a crowded room, whether you want it to or not, sharp and sudden the same way it was 15 years ago. She was standing near the bar with her husband Bryce, a bank vice president I'd heard about through mutual friends but never actually met in person until that night. "Andre," she said, stepping toward me with a drink already half gone in her hand. "Still fixing air conditioners? Or did you finally get promoted to something with a desk?" Bryce laughed into his champagne like she'd said something clever. The kind of laugh you give when you're agreeing to be entertained, rather than because something actually struck you funny. A few people near us glanced over, not quite sure whether to laugh along or look away, caught in that particular discomfort of watching somebody get needled in public. I noticed, not for the first time, how little her tone had actually changed over the years. The same practiced lightness she used to use back at that Fed Hill cookout, like cruelty delivered with a smile, doesn't count as cruelty at all. I let it land, without flinching. "I'm doing all right," I said. "All right?" Denise repeated, tilting her head. The same tilt she used to give me back when she was deciding whether to push further or let something go. "That's generous. Last I heard, you were still in that same house on Eastern Avenue. Some men just don't move forward, I guess." I thought about telling her right then. I decided against it. Some truths don't need to be handed to a room. They arrive on their own schedule, and this one had an appointment in about 10 minutes. Bryce checked his watch, the same watch I'd later learned cost more than my first car, and said, "The bank's actually sponsoring part of tonight's program, so we should probably find our seats." Of course you are, I said. And I meant nothing by it, though something in his face flickered like he'd heard more than I'd actually said. I found my seat at a table near the middle of the room, next to Renata, who'd worn a deep blue dress for the occasion and kept checking her phone every few minutes with the particular restlessness of somebody who knows something is about to happen. You didn't tell them yet, she said quietly, meaning Denise. Wasn't planning to, I said. Figured the room would tell them for me. She smiled at that, small and knowing, and reached over to straighten my collar the way an older sister might, though she's actually 2 years younger than me. Across the room, I could see Denise laughing at something one of Bryce's colleagues said, head thrown back, that same performative brightness she'd always had at gatherings like this. The kind meant to be seen as much as felt. I thought briefly about the 4th of July cookout in Fed Hill all those years ago. The way she'd introduced me as Zoe's dad, like the marriage had never happened. And I felt nothing sharp about it anymore, just a kind of distant recognition, like remembering a scene from somebody else's life. A server passed with a tray of champagne, and I took a glass out of habit more than desire, mostly just to have something to hold. We drifted toward separate tables as the lights dimmed and the MC stepped up to the podium, a woman in a deep green gown who thanked the sponsors, thanked the mayor's office, and moved into what she called the moment we've all been waiting for. This year, she said, the chamber received the largest single philanthropic pledge in its history, tied to the acquisition of a Baltimore-based company that's about to change how working families across this country access support. The company is called Solo Parent, built from the ground up by a Baltimore native who spent 5 years developing it quietly while working full-time and raising his daughter alone. This week, Solo Parent was acquired by Family Bridge Corp. For $287 million, and its founder has pledged a portion of that to local family support programs right here in this city. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the founder of Solo Parent, Mr. Andre Whitfield. The applause started slow, a few uncertain claps, then rolled across the ballroom in a wave that picked up speed as more people connected the name to the man now standing up from his chair. I stood up. Every head near my table turned. I walked toward the stage past the table where Denise and Bryce were sitting, and I didn't slow my pace or meet their eyes, though I could feel the shift in the air the same way you feel the change in barometric pressure before a storm. The news cameras near the front of the stage swung toward me first, the red recording lights blinking steady as I stepped up under the lights, my shoes suddenly very loud against the hardwood. I didn't have a long speech prepared. I said thank you to the chamber. Thank you to my daughter for being the reason any of it mattered. And thank you to a version of myself 5 years ago who kept showing up on nights nobody was watching. There's a woman here tonight I should also thank, I said. And I felt the room lean in slightly, unsure where that sentence was headed. My mother, who never once asked me to explain myself on the nights I didn't have an explanation ready. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, warm rather than sharp. Then the camera operator, doing exactly what cameras do at these events, panned across the crowd to capture the room's reaction. And it landed, for just a few seconds, on Denise's table. She was sitting perfectly still, champagne glass halfway to her mouth and forgotten there. Her face doing that particular kind of math people do when a number refuses to fit the story they've already written about somebody. Bryce wasn't looking at the stage at all. He was looking down at his own hands, jaw tight. The exact posture of a man doing calculations he didn't want anyone to watch him make. I stepped down from the stage to another round of applause, and Renata met me at the bottom of the steps, squeezing my arm once, hard, the way you do when words feel insufficient for the moment. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, and mostly meant it. I made my way back toward my seat. And that's when a man I recognized from the local business press, a reporter named Foster, who'd covered a few chamber events before, stopped me near the edge of the room, notepad already half open in his hand. Mr. Whitfield, quick question if you don't mind. I actually recognize your ex-wife's husband over there, Bryce Calloway. He's a VP at Colonial Trust, isn't he? That's right, I said, not sure where this was headed. Foster lowered his voice, glancing once toward Denise's table before continuing. 2 years ago, I did a piece on small business lending gaps in this city. Colonial Trust was one of the banks that came up repeatedly for rejecting minority-owned startup applications, citing risk profiles that didn't hold up against the actual numbers. I remember pulling a few anonymized case summaries for that story. One of them was almost identical to your situation. An HVAC technician applying for a development loan, denied for what the internal notes called unstable income. I felt something settle in my chest, cold and quiet, not anger exactly. More like a puzzle piece finally clicking into a place it had been circling for years. That was me, I said. Foster's eyebrows lifted slightly. I figured it might be. I never printed names, but I remember the loan officer listed on that file. It was Calloway. You planning to say anything about that publicly? Foster asked. No, I said. I don't need to. The room already did the math on its own tonight. Foster nodded slowly, closed his notepad and said, For what it's worth, that's a better story than the one I would have written anyway. He hesitated a second longer before adding, You know, most people in your position would have wanted that printed. Would have wanted the satisfaction of it out there. Maybe, I said. But satisfaction that needs an audience usually doesn't last very long. I've had 5 years to figure out the kind that does. He walked off towards the bar, and I stood there a moment longer, letting the ballroom noise wash back over me, letting myself feel, for just a second, exactly how far a kitchen table and a cracked laptop had actually carried me. I made my way back toward my table, and on the way, I passed close enough to Denise and Bryce that I couldn't avoid it entirely. Congratulations, Bryce said, extending a hand that felt cooler than the room, his voice carrying none of the ease it had held an hour earlier. I shook it once, brief, and said, Thank you. Denise didn't say anything right away. She looked at me the way you look at a photograph that's been developed wrong. The image technically recognizable, but somehow not matching the memory you had of it. I really didn't know, she finally said, about any of it. I know, I said. That was kind of the point. I didn't say it unkindly. It was just true. The same way most of the things I'd learned to say over the last 5 years had become plain and true instead of sharp and defensive. I walked away before either of them could say anything else, back to my table, where Renata was waiting, with a look that asked everything without saying a word. You good? She asked, echoing the same question Jerome would ask me on the porch the next morning, the question everybody seemed to be asking that night. Yeah, I said. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually believed it completely. No qualifiers attached. I didn't stay much longer after that. I found Renata, told her I was heading out, and walked back through the lobby toward the parking garage. The harbor air cold and clean against my face after the heat of that ballroom. My phone buzzed twice on the drive home, both times from a number I still had saved as Denise, even years later, out of habit more than anything else. I didn't look at it at a red light on Eastern Avenue, the same street my father used to walk home on after 12-hour shifts. Boots heavy, hands stained with grease he could never quite scrub all the way out, no matter how hard he tried. When I finally checked it in the driveway, there were 2 messages. The first read, I had no idea. Congratulations, genuinely. The second, sent 4 minutes later, read, I'm sorry for tonight. For a lot of things, honestly. I sat in the truck for a while, engine off, porch light already on, because my mother always leaves it on when she's watching Zoe. The same way she's done since I was a kid, coming home late from service calls with my father. I didn't answer the texts that night. Some doors don't need slamming shut. You can just let them ease closed on their own weight, and that's its own kind of answer, quieter than any argument could ever be. Inside, my mother was on the couch with the television low. Zoe asleep upstairs with one arm hanging off the edge of the bed, the way she always sleeps. Blanket kicked halfway to the floor. My mother looked up at me and said, "You look like a man carrying something." "I am," I said. "Just not the kind that hurts anymore." I told her about the gala, about the announcement, about Denise's face in that crowd, about Bryce staring at his own hands like they belonged to somebody else. She listened without saying much, the way she always has, and when I finished, she just nodded slowly and said, "Your father would have sat right here and said nothing at all. He'd have just gone up and checked on Zoe, so that's what I did." I stood in the doorway of Zoe's room for a long minute, watching her breathe, the hallway light throwing a soft yellow line across her blanket, the room smelling faintly like the lavender lotion my mother always puts on her at bedtime. I thought about the cracked laptop still sitting in my kitchen drawer, screen held together with packing tape gone yellow at the edges, 5 years of 2 in the morning stitched into that machine. I thought about carrying it down to the basement the next day and finally letting it rest, not out of anger, but because it had already done everything I ever asked of it, and some things earned their retirement. The next morning, I sat on the front steps of the house on Eastern Avenue with a cup of coffee, the same steps my father used to untie his boots on, the block quiet except for a dog barking somewhere down near the corner store, and a bus groaning past 2 blocks over. My oldest friend, Jerome, who I've known since the 6th grade, came by around 9 like he said he would. 2 coffees in a cardboard tray, even though I already had one going cold beside me. "Saw the news," he said, sitting down next to me, setting the tray between us. "Whole city's talking about it." My cousin sent me a clip from the local news this morning before I even had my eyes open. "I noticed," I said. "Phone's been going off since 6. You good?" I thought about it honestly before answering, the way I try to answer Jerome, because he's one of maybe 3 people who'd know if I was lying to him anyway. "I keep waiting to feel something bigger than I feel," I said. "Like it's supposed to hit different. It doesn't, though. It just feels like a Tuesday that happened to have cameras in it." Jerome laughed, low and easy, the same laugh he's had since we were 14 years old, cutting through Patterson Park on our bikes. "That's because the real win wasn't last night, man. The real win's been happening for 5 years. Last night was just the part everybody finally got to see." We sat there a while, coffee going lukewarm, watching a few neighbors head out for the morning. Somebody's kid riding a bike in slow circles at the end of the block. The pagoda visible in the distance through the bare trees. "You gonna talk to Denise?" Jerome asked eventually. "Eventually," I said. "Not today, though. Today's for Zoe." "She's still asking about that laptop?" I smiled a little. "She thinks it's a dinosaur. Told me last week I should get a real computer, like the cracked one wasn't a real computer this whole time." "She's not wrong." "No," I said. "But that dinosaur is the reason we don't have to worry about braces or field trips or much of anything else anymore. I owe it a little more respect than that." "You keeping it?" "Thinking about it," I said. "Might put it in a drawer somewhere, not to look at every day, just to know it's there." Jerome nodded like that made perfect sense to him, because it did, because he'd watched enough of those two in the morning years from the outside to understand what the machine actually meant. Jerome and I sat quiet for a while after that. The kind of comfortable silence you only get with somebody who's known you since before you had anything worth being quiet about. "You remember when we used to ride bikes past that old McMecken building?" he said eventually, nodding vaguely toward downtown. "And you used to say one day you'd own a building like that?" "I said a lot of things at 14, I said. "You also said you'd never leave this block," he said. "And here you are." "Here I am," I agreed. You thinking about moving? Now that you've got all that money? I thought about it honestly. Not really, I said. Maybe fix the roof finally. Get Zoe a bigger room. But this street's got my father's whole life in it. I'm not in a hurry to leave that behind. Jerome nodded like that made sense to him too, the way most things about me seemed to make sense to him without requiring much explanation. Zoe came out onto the porch not long after, still in pajamas, hair wrapped for bed, rubbing her eyes against the morning light, socked feet padding across the cold concrete step. "Morning, Daddy?" "Morning, baby." She climbed up next to me on the step without asking what had happened the night before, without any idea that her father's life had shifted in some official, financial, headline-making way, while she slept 2 miles away at her grandmother's house. To her, it was just another Saturday morning with her dad on the porch. Coffee smell in the air, Jerome cracking jokes about the neighbor's dog. The ordinary rhythm of a life she'd never known any differently. And honestly, that was exactly how I wanted it to stay. At least for one more morning, before the rest of the world caught all the way up to what had already been true for years. I thought about the years I'd spent believing that if I just worked hard enough, quiet enough, long enough, somebody would eventually hand me proof that I mattered. Some certificate or check or headline that would finally settle the question for good. Sitting on those steps with my daughter's head leaning against my shoulder, I understood something I hadn't let myself believe before. The proof was never going to come from a stage or a headline or a room full of people finally doing the math correctly and adjusting their opinion of me accordingly. It had been sitting right there on that porch the whole time, small and warm and half asleep against my arm, exactly where it had always been. Later that afternoon, after Jerome left and Zoe went down for a nap, I finally opened the cracked laptop one last time, sitting alone at the same kitchen table where all of it had started. I scrolled back through years of old files, early prototypes that never worked, notes I'd written myself at 2 and 3 in the morning, half-finished sentences that read now like messages from somebody I barely remembered being. I didn't delete anything. I just sat with it a while, the way you sit with an old photograph, letting the weight of it settle before closing the lid one final time and carrying it down to the basement, setting it on a shelf next to a box of my father's old tools. 2 objects from 2 different decades, built by 2 men who never once needed anybody to see them working. One with a wrench and one with a keyboard, though I've come to believe the tool never really mattered as much as the showing up did. I stood there a moment in the quiet of the basement, one hand resting on the closed laptop, and I let myself feel, fully and without hurrying past it, exactly how far the last 5 years had actually carried me. Denise texted one more time that evening, after Zoe had gone back to my mother's for a movie night and the house had gone quiet again. "Can we talk sometime?" Not to ask for anything, just to talk. I looked at it for a long moment, the porch light already glowing against the dusk. The same bulb I'd changed myself just a few weeks earlier. I typed back 4 words. "Yeah, some other week." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet, and it wasn't a door slammed shut either. It was just honest, which felt like enough for a Tuesday or a Saturday or whatever ordinary day was standing in front of me next. A few weeks later, Denise and I did sit down, at a coffee shop near her office rather than anywhere either of us called home. Both of us careful and a little formal with each other in a way that felt necessary after everything. She didn't ask for money, and I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy for people to assume that's what a conversation like that is always about. She mostly wanted to say she was sorry, in more specific terms than the text message had allowed, for the cookout in Fed Hill, for the comment at the Gala, for a longer list of moments I hadn't realized she'd been keeping count of, too. "I think I spent a long time needing you to be behind me," she said, turning her cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. It made it easier to feel good about where I ended up. I didn't have a clever response for that. I just told her I appreciated her saying it, and that Zoe was the only thing either of us needed to keep getting right from here forward. We didn't leave that coffee shop as friends exactly, but we left it as two people who'd finally stopped needing to win something from each other, which felt like its own kind of quiet relief. I drove home after that conversation with the windows cracked, cold air moving through the truck, and I found myself taking the long way back, past the old McMecken building Jerome had brought up on the porch, past the community college where Denise and I first met in a night class neither of us particularly wanted to be in. I stopped at a red light near Patterson Park, close enough to see the pagoda through the bare December trees, and I sat there a moment longer than the light required, just looking at it. The same silhouette I'd known my whole life. I thought about my father, gone 6 years now, and how much I wished I could tell him about the gala, about the number, about the way the room had gone quiet and then loud again in that particular order. I don't know exactly what he would have said. Knowing him, probably not much, just a nod, maybe a hand on my shoulder, the same economy of words he'd used his whole life. But I like to think he would have understood immediately, without needing the number explained to him, that the real accomplishment had already happened years earlier, back when nobody was clapping, back when the only proof I had was a cracked laptop and a kid asleep upstairs who trusted me completely without knowing why she should. A few months after the acquisition closed, I used part of the money to set up a modest scholarship fund at the same community college where Denise and I met, aimed specifically at single parents trying to finish degrees while working full-time. The exact situation half the people building Solo Parents' user base were living through every single day. I didn't put my name on it in any large way, just a small line in the paperwork, because the point was never to be thanked for it. The point was making sure some other tired parent, sitting up at 1 in the morning with a cracked laptop of their own, might have one less thing standing between them and whatever they were quietly trying to build. Renata told me once that most people, once they finally get their moment on a stage, spend years trying to get back up there again, chasing the same applause a second and third time. I understood what she meant, but it never quite applied to me the way she expected it to. The stage was never really the point. It was just the one night the room happened to catch up with what a kitchen table already knew. People keep asking me what changed the night of that gala, like there's some single moment I can point to and say, that's when everything turned. There isn't one. The truth is, everything that mattered had already turned years earlier. On ordinary nights, nobody was filming in a kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee and cracked plastic, on a laptop that cost less than the watch my ex-wife's husband wears on his left wrist. My father used to say a man doesn't need anybody to see him working. He just needs to make sure he's there when it counts. I used to think that meant showing up for other people. I understand now it also means showing up for the version of yourself that nobody else has bothered to believe in yet. The one working alone at a kitchen table long after everybody else has gone to sleep. Denise's words in that ballroom didn't wound me the way they might have 5 years earlier. They just told me clearly how little had changed on her side of the room, while everything had changed on mine. I don't carry anger toward her, and I want to be honest about that, instead of pretending otherwise, for the sake of a cleaner story. I carry something closer to understanding, the kind that comes only after you've stopped needing somebody's approval to feel steady on your own feet. If you're sitting somewhere tonight feeling unseen, doing work nobody claps for, raising somebody or building something, or simply holding a life together with your own 2 hands, while the world assumes you're standing still, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need a ballroom. You don't need a stage or a headline or a number with commas in it to prove what you already know about yourself in the quiet parts of your own mind. Dignity, at any age, isn't a speech delivered under bright lights in front of a crowd that finally decided to pay attention. It's a Tuesday spent showing up anyway, with nobody watching, with nothing guaranteed at the end of it. It's the porch chosen over the argument, The quiet decision to keep building instead of demanding somebody notice you're building. Andre didn't win the night of that gala because a number finally impressed the people who doubted him. He'd already won years earlier, alone, at a kitchen table, on a cracked laptop nobody was watching, on 100 ordinary nights that never once made the news. That kind of peace is available to anyone, willing to keep showing up in the dark, one ordinary night at a time, until it finally becomes something the whole room can see, whether the room deserves to see it or not. You don't need the room. The room will catch up eventually, or it won't. And either way, the work was never really for the room to begin with. It was always for the small, warm, half-asleep person leaning against your shoulder on an ordinary Saturday morning, the one who never needed a single headline to already know exactly who you are.